I just watched a video by a woman from Australia named Brianne Worth, and I'll put the link to her video in the description. And she is just utterly clueless. It's just incredible how misinformed people like her are. They constantly bring up the mass murders in the USA, or the murder rate in general, and they time and time again fail to mention, or maybe they don't even realize, but they don't mention that we don't have a gun problem in the USA. They always say we do. We do not have a gun problem in the USA, though. We have a not keeping criminals in prison problem. There is perhaps nowhere else in the nation where this is more true than my home state of California. California has been on a real streak lately of releasing violent people from prison. Not surprisingly, the crime rates go up, and innocent people have been caught in the crossfire. It's just incredible that, you know, they release these people from prison, and in the near future they're going to release another 10,000 criminals from prison. This state is not meeting its responsibility to its citizens. Back in the 1990s, a girl named Kimber Reynolds was shot to death, and her dad was one of the main forces behind our three strikes law. When that three strike law was put in place, we quickly went from one of the most dangerous states, one of the most violent states in the nation, one of the most crime-ridden states in the nation, to one of the safer ones. And Prop 47 has undermined that. And again, we've turned loose a lot of criminals. And violent crime has risen, property crime has risen. And as I said, in the near future, I was just watching the news the other day, they're planning to release another 10,000 criminals. This is going to return California to the levels of violence seen back in the 1990s. I'd encourage everyone to look that up. California was a very, very violent place in the 1990s. We do not need to return to that. Since this Prop 47 has been put in place and these criminals have been released and they've committed crimes again once they are released, this is something else I'd encourage people to do is look up the kind of crimes that where innocents have been caught in the crossfire by people who have been recently released from prison. They just cannot refrain from preying on innocent people. Now that these people have been released and we're having these problems, the answer from the state governor, from the state legislature, is not to put teeth back in our sentencing laws so that as these people recommit crimes, that they go back to prison so the rest of us can go about our business in safety. No, they passed several gun and ammunition control laws. Was a certain number, there was a certain limit that they wanted to put in place on the number of rounds people could buy in a month. They do have a limit on how many handguns people can buy, of one per month. They're trying to put that in place for rifles and shotguns, one per month. And that simply is not fair. You know, people should, I mean, this is part of freedom. If people can afford to buy a gun once a week, they should be able to do so. I don't think anyone that's listening to this would much appreciate if there was a limit placed on how much they could buy of whatever is produced at their workplaces. That would mean people are laid off. That's interference with commerce. We are supposed to have a free market in the USA. Limiting what people can buy and what quantities is contrary to that principle. The vast majority of American gun owners, tens of millions of them, go through their entire lives without harming anyone. And it's not fair to take it out on people who are law-abiding because of people who aren't. That is just fundamentally unjust. It's contrary to American principles. You don't treat the innocent the same as you do the criminal. Or should not. We should not be doing that. We have all these criminals that were in prison. And so many people say, well, so and so, the 3 strikes and your 3rd strike, and then you're put in prison for life. And this person stole a pizza, and that was his 3rd strike, and he went to prison for life. Yeah, but the prior time he robbed a store, assaulted a person, committed serious crimes. If you already have 2 strikes and you go out and steal a pizza, that's by choice. We have got to get back to this personal responsibility. I mean, no one forced that person to steal a pizza on their 3rd strike. They knew they had 2 strikes, and they knew they could get caught trying to steal something. And that kind of accountability is why 3 strikes worked and why it reduced our crime rates. Now, we are letting these people out. They know they can practically, well, in many cases, they know they can get away, literally away with murder. And they know that law enforcement, or not the police, but the politicians, don't have the backbone. And they know that these politicians aren't serious about getting tough on crime, and that emboldens them. So they're out and about among us committing crimes again because they're emboldened. And they know there is little to nothing in the way of consequences for their actions. So that emboldens them to commit more and more crimes. And that will happen and continue to happen. It will increase as long as they are so emboldened, as long as they have this idea that there are no consequences for their actions. Given that they are already emboldened, the worst thing you can do on top of it, since they're already out of prison, is make it harder for honest citizens to keep guns in their house, to buy guns, and even to carry them. A gun doesn't do you much good if you can't take it with you, by the way. It's helpful to have one at home, but then you're vulnerable when you're not at home. Politicians in the state legislature aren't happy that there are sheriffs who grant concealed carry permits to people that have no records. That they say, oh, well, this sheriff or that sheriff hands out these concealed carry permits like candy. Why shouldn't a law-abiding citizen be able to carry a gun? If you want to look at a miscarriage of justice, just a fundamentally unjust situation, is that someone who will never harm anyone in their lives, unless someone happens to be harming them, perhaps, but they'll never just go randomly harm someone that's minding their own business. It is fundamentally unjust to say that that person cannot arm themselves. And yet that's the situation we have here in California and 7 other states, where you have to ask permission to carry a gun to defend yourself. Now, how is that right? I got into this argument with someone recently that said, well, you don't have to ask for permission, and ask me, where's proof of that? Because you're just talking conspiracy theories. No, I'm not. In this state and 7 others, you in fact do have to ask for permission from your sheriff to carry a gun. You can have a clean record, you can have stable employment history, you can be a pillar of the community, and you can be denied a handgun, a carry permit for any reason or for no reason. Some counties are very bad about this. They'll even deny a permit if a neighbor objects. Incredible. You're right. What is supposed to be your right is subject to your neighbor's approval. That is a cornerstone of Western civilization, really. It's in our Constitution. It's a fundamental human right to self-preservation, and self-defense is part of that. It's in English common law. That's why we have the Second Amendment. Too many people don't see the value of the Second Amendment. There are several laws that this state is just ridiculous. I hardly know where to begin, but they passed laws against high-capacity magazines. There's some people in the state that want to ban detachable magazines altogether. That, again, that doesn't do any good. That is not going to solve the crime problem. Putting people in prison is going to solve the crime problem. And this gets back to the people from other Western countries, because you see this from people from the United Kingdom and Australia, and not quite as much Canada anymore, because they've actually had significant increases in gun ownership in Canada. In fact, on a per capita basis, I think they're 5th in the world now. Particularly Australia and the UK, because they've had huge gun confiscation programs over the past 20 years. And then they look at the mass shootings here, or the murders that we have here, and they say, well, it's all because you guys have guns. No, we have a criminal problem here. We have a not punishing criminals problem here. That is the core of it. And this idea that we should punish people that never cause problems. You know, I sound like a broken record, but it is fundamentally unjust. The people that go through their lives and never harm anyone, it's like there's tens of millions of gun owners. Most people go through their days and their weeks and their months and just year after year after year, and it never crosses their mind to harm someone. Most people are like this, and you give that same person a gun, and that is still the farthest thing from their mind, is to harm someone. You could give them a type of gun that they don't have because it's prohibited, and that'll still be the farthest thing from their mind. You could give them a machine gun, and that is still the farthest thing from their mind. This idea that guns make murderers out of someone is just some of the sloppiest thinking I've ever heard. I'm not sure exactly why, you know, people from the United Kingdom and people from Australia some of them get so exercised about our gun laws here, or lack of them, as they say, but it's really no skin off their backs. So I've wondered about that, and there is somewhat of a push, I mean, limited as it is, and among a small group in Australia and in the United Kingdom, and perhaps that's an effort to discredit those groups in those two countries. Perhaps they don't want that movement to gain steam and gain members and gain momentum. Taking our problems out of context here and misattributing the cause of them is what is driving that in the UK and in Australia. It's easy to do. It's like it's fear mongering. It's saying, look, you know, they always say Americans have 320 million guns. That's nearly one gun for every person, and that's nearly one gun for every man, woman, and child in the USA. And we don't want that here in the United Kingdom. We don't want that here in Australia. Otherwise, we'll be just as violent as the USA is then. And that is not true. But it's fear mongering, and they seem to be very effective at it. A person that's a citizen of the United Kingdom or an Australian citizen has the right to bear arms just like we do. The American Second Amendment does not grant Americans the right to bear arms. It recognizes that it's a right. It says to the government, and this is the point of our Bill of Rights, it more than anything limits the government. It tells the government you can't infringe free speech, you can't infringe people's right to bear arms, you can't take people's property without due process of law. That due process of law, I mean, that's a can of worms right there, and that's something I can do a whole video on, because this whole administrative law, this law set by bureaucrats, is part of how we're losing our liberties in the USA. And that is why Congress needs to make laws. People like Dianne Feinstein, you know, I'm not going to get off too much on this, because, like I said, it could take a long time in and of itself. But, you know, people like Dianne Feinstein say that we need that administrative law because we need the specialized people, the scientists and the engineers in those bureaucracies, in those agencies to set law, because we don't have that expertise in Congress. Congress is full of university-educated people, and they can't write environmental law. There is no accountability among these bureaucrats. There is among Congress. That's why Congress is the law-making body of this country. And they've abdicated that to all these bureaucracies. It's hard to do anything about those bureaucracies. It is why they need to be reined in. If a bunch of university-educated Congress people cannot deal with the intricacies of environmental law or patent law or whatever, they are doing their job. And, you know, if they want, they can invite an engineer or a scientist to testify in front of Congress as they're writing these laws. But Congress should be writing the laws. It is fear-mongering. Well, if you don't want to be like the USA, you don't want guns, you'll be, dealing with all these murders and all of this, and they ignore what is really the cause of America's higher murder rate. And guns are not the problem. Banning them won't solve the problem. It is still fundamentally a problem with just not enforcing laws against murder and robbery and burglary and practically down to jaywalking. The person you catch committing a minor crime is also the people that, by and large, are doing the major crimes, the felonies. This is what Rudy Giuliani did when he was mayor of New York City, and he brought the crime down in that city because he said, by and large, criminals are criminals. Sometimes they're committing felonies, sometimes they're committing misdemeanors. You catch one, you prosecute them for the misdemeanor, take them off the streets for a while, and they aren't committing the felonies anymore either while they're off the street. And that is the way you have to approach it. But we've redefined what crime is in California. A lot of stuff is a misdemeanor or even infraction that used to be something that could get you a lengthy sentence behind bars. And even stealing someone's gun, if a crook steals a gun now, that's a misdemeanor. And they practically treat it like a speeding ticket. They cite you and just make you sign an agreement to appear in court, like when you get pulled over for speeding. The idea that you're stealing someone's gun and that's a misdemeanor, I mean, that should just not be. That should be a serious crime. And I read my local paper, and assault is a misdemeanor now. That should be a felony. When you're invading someone's liberty that way, when you're actually attacking them, that should not be a misdemeanor. That is a serious invasion of someone else. It really does embolden the criminals. They embolden the criminals by letting them out of prison, by not making them face the consequences of what they did. And then they embolden them more by making it harder for people to carry guns. And there's a real push for that in this state right now. And it's not easy to carry a gun in this state as it is, but they're trying to make it harder. What a stupid thing it is that someone has to ask permission to defend themselves, to carry a gun. And like I said, I've been in this discussion with people time and time again. You do have to ask, in 8 states still, you have to ask your sheriff permission. There are about 12 states where you can carry without a permit, another 30 where they grant permits to anyone who has no criminal record, and then the remaining 8 who still do it the old-fashioned way, that you actually have to have a permit. And you can be denied for any reason or no reason whatsoever. And it is having to ask permission. And I just got in this argument with someone, and it got very heated that, well, you don't have to ask permission. That's just conspiracy theories. Prove it. I told this person what the law was, that you do, in fact, have to apply with the county sheriff for a permit. And that person said, oh, a permit. Well, that's not permission. Permit, permission, that's all the same root. The word has the same root. You cannot carry a gun legally unless you go to the sheriff, fill out the paperwork, and they say, yeah, you can do that. And if you do it without that piece of paper, you can be arrested for carrying a gun. You can be a person that's never going to harm anyone. And chances are, you are that type of person. It's insane. It just is insane. It's hard to talk about this in a calm way. Just the kind of dense attitude people have on the other side of it so often, and they're just oblivious to logic. It just ideas bounce off them like BBs off an army tank. It just is incredible, and you just can't reason with some people. We all have our moments, but at least I try to be reasonable, and I think most people do. But some people, if anyone from the United Kingdom or Australia is listening, I don't think everyone in those 2 countries is that way. But a lot are, and it's frustrating how much they've been brainwashed. That is government's valid role, is to say they can't have guns. We should be very, very concerned about this. I mean, a government that does not want its own citizens to have guns is a government that is up to no good. And it's such a internationalist push for this. And I think that's why part of why there's so many attacks on it internationally toward the USA. Because it's no direct effect on someone in Australia or the United Kingdom that we can own and carry guns much more easily here. There's something at work when people are so exercised about the citizens of some country having a gun, about the citizens within it having guns. What threatens someone in the UK or Australia about Americans having guns? It isn't the guns themselves. That's no threat to someone in the United Kingdom or Australia. It's the idea that civilians own guns and do so in huge numbers, that tens of millions of people, probably in the neighborhood of 50% of American households have guns. It's the symbolism of that, again, that they don't want that taking root over there. They don't want that kind of idea to gain momentum in those countries because their citizens are no longer defenseless. A government that wants to disarm you just cannot be trusted, and it is about people control. If you think it's a good idea that the citizens of a nation aren't armed and the government is, you need to read about every totalitarian government for the past couple hundred years. That is a horrible idea. It's a dangerous idea. You should be very, very skeptical of anyone who has that idea. The BBC, I've noticed, is not very friendly to the idea of gun ownership in America. Although I've seen a few presentations of theirs that are balanced, at least more balanced than I'd expect the BBC to be about it. Now, The Guardian, on the other hand, is not balanced at all. They send someone over to the USA every once in a while, and you can see these videos on YouTube, that really go out of their way to portray American gun owners just in the worst light possible. They pick dumbest people among us, the most idiotic sounding people among us. That can be done for any argument, whether it's on the left of the political spectrum, the right. It can be done here in America. It can be done on both sides of the political spectrum in the United Kingdom. It can be done on both sides of the political spectrum in Australia. Every political persuasion. And that can be found. And again, that kind of gets back to the idea of justice too. That you do not treat the innocent, you do not treat the law-abiding, you do not treat people that aren't hurting other people as you do criminals. Someone that owns a rifle, a semi-automatic rifle, with a high-capacity magazine, they are not hurting anyone, and they will not. We have about the same amount of deaths due to drunk driving, auto accidents every year as we do homicides. We do not, no one is suggesting that we take everyone's driver's license away because of that. It would solve the problem, make everyone take trains and planes and city buses and whatever, subways. That would get rid of the drunk driving deaths. And no one's suggesting that. And even though, by the way, driving is a privilege in the USA. We have a freedom of travel. We have a right to travel. But actually, driving is a privilege. If I lost my driver's license, I couldn't drive anymore legally. But I'd still be able to travel. I could take buses, subways, airplanes, trains. I could hitch rides with friends. I could take taxis, whatever. I'd still, legally, they couldn't stop me from getting around. It's less convenient than driving, granted, but driving itself is a privilege, and that privilege can be taken away if you get too many speeding tickets or, drive while drunk or what have you. But gun ownership and carrying of a gun is a right. In this country now, we treat the privilege of driving as practically sacred. But the right to own a gun and to carry a gun, that's negotiable. That's treated more like a privilege than the actual privilege. Even though both result in about the same amount of deaths per year. Why are they so concerned about the gun deaths but not the drunk driving deaths? I don't know. It's just that there's a disconnect there, just logically speaking. They're not directly affected by our gun laws. Like I said, that they've been so poisoned to the idea of gun ownership that they don't even like it over here. But as long as the left in the United Kingdom and as long as the left in Australia successfully keep that focus here, they'll be less likely to say, you know what, we think it's a good idea that people should be able to own and carry guns here more easily in Australia or the United Kingdom. That's why they constantly keep that pressure on and keep that in the spotlight. It is distracting people in those countries from something better. It is sad to me when I watched about the United Kingdom and Australia, all those guns being destroyed. And they'd been in families for generations, and some of them were very beautifully done guns and very expensive ones. There's such a waste to destroy all of those. It really is a waste. What really motivated me to do this was this Brianne Worth from Australia, who just despises the fact that we have guns. She put a video together. Quite honestly, it was one of the stupidest things, the dumbest things I'd ever seen in my life. People said as much in the comment sections, and it's like, didn't even make an impression with her. But it's just, the lack of logic in her video is incredible. I'll put a link to it in the description for this video, and this is American slang here that I'm not sure, this is American slang here that you may or may not have heard, but I mean, that just really got my goat, which is, to say it really pissed me off. It angered me. If people from Australia or the United Kingdom want to comment on gun laws, fine. It's just that I don't mind that. I don't mind these sorts of discussions. I even welcome them. But if they're at least an attempt to be intellectually honest about it, and she was not, and I don't think she has the capability to be. Much of what she said was lifted directly from those Jeff Jeffries so-called comedy bits about American guns. She really was acting like a parrot. She wasn't really thinking on her own. And again, I'm not sure she has that capability. It's incredible because Australia is another Western nation. And I would never say the Western nations are carbon copies of each other, even the English-speaking Western nations. But Australia's roots are also in Britain, are also from Britain. That she seems to have this huge separation. Just seems incredible to me. Where I thought this was most obvious when she said something about your silly imaginary right to own a piece of metal, the piece of metal being a gun. I mean, that shows such a fundamental misunderstanding of the Second Amendment and the right we have to bear arms. Another point, she said something about, it's like a kid getting its toy taken away and all that. And that's a lack of seriousness, the lack of gravity that she has in all this. There are very important reasons why everything in the American Bill of Rights is there, and that's to limit the government, trial by jury, the right to property, the right to free speech, all of those, and the right to bear arms. Those are all very, very important, and they all place limits on the government. And it's important to have a limited government, and that rule of law. I mean, that is a cornerstone of Western civilization. Right there is rule of law. And the American Bill of Rights gets to rule of law. There are certain things the government cannot do according to that. And that should not be negotiable. And when it starts to become negotiable, you're getting away from rule of law. When you get away from rule of law, no one really knows quite what to expect from the government. They don't quite know what they do. It keeps everyone a little off balance and allows tyranny to take root. And that's important. That's important in Australia and the United Kingdom as well. And that's something that the Brianne Worth does not understand. The rule of law means the government has to live by the law as well as the citizens. When you start to let the government ignore the law, that's where tyranny takes root. That's where a certain demoralization starts to take root. And the very foundation of it all starts to crumble when that happens. And if there are a lot of people like Brianne Worth in Australia, maybe it's crumbled there to a greater extent than it has even here in the USA. This threat of disarming the civilian population is a serious one. We've made great progress. 30 years ago, in nearly all states, people couldn't carry a gun at all, in a lot of them. Even police couldn't carry guns unless they were on duty in some of them. But in most states, there were a lot where private citizens carrying guns wasn't allowed at all. And in most of the others, the permit process was nearly impossible. And there were a few, like Vermont, they've had no permit carry for 200 years. And, so there's a few, but the fact is, in most of the U.S. 30 years ago, it was very difficult for anyone to carry a gun in almost all the states. Now, anyone with no criminal record can carry a gun in 42, and the other 8, well, you have to ask the sheriff for permission. So, I mean, there's been serious progress made, but then again, the 1934 Firearms Act, National Firearms Act, is still in place. There was a law in 1986 reining in the abuses of the ATF, and that was good law. But then there was this Democrat from New Jersey that, in order to get his vote, they put in this Hughes Amendment. His name was Hughes. He's a Democrat from New Jersey. You can look this up. And that Hughes Amendment, well, part of that 1934 Firearms Act was that you had to pay a $200 tax to get a fully automatic weapon. That was a lot of money in 1934. By the 80s, it wasn't so much. There were Democrats that were upset that people could more easily get automatic weapons. So that was the Hughes Amendment to rein in the abuses of the ATF that wound up in that FOPA law from 1986. It restricted people to buying fully automatic weapons to ones that were already in circulation in private hands. So you could no longer go to a manufacturer and buy a gun. Well, that sharply restricted the supply, so the prices spiked. That was put in there specifically to restrict the supply of them, and because that $200 tax really didn't matter by 1986, because $200 wasn't nearly as much money. So that Hughes Amendment is also just very bad law. I've included a link to the White House petition page to repeal both the National Firearms Act and that Hughes Amendment. So people should be able to buy fully automatic weapons, and there are places where people own them, and they're much more expensive now because of the restriction on the supply of them. But there's like the Sandy Shoot in Arizona once a year where people go out and shoot them, and people should be able to buy those if they choose. And restricting the supply of it has driven the price up so much that fewer people can afford them. That is just wrong. Again, this is supposed to be a right. I challenge anyone to find me where anyone's been shot by a fully automatic weapon lately. Again, it doesn't matter. Most people, the farthest thing from their mind is killing someone or harming someone. You give them a pistol, you give them a rifle, you give them a machine gun, you give them a grenade launcher, you give them a bazooka, you can give them a tank. And that'll still be the farthest thing from their mind. In fact, there's a guy in Texas that he set up a business where people drive tanks around and fire the guns on the tanks. So it's hard to get this stuff. It's a lot of red tape, but people can own them. It's just the ease of ownership is not that great. They're kind of getting around the spirit of the Second Amendment in a way through things like that Hughes Act and that tax on them from the 1934 Firearms Act, and that's just wrong. And when the homicide rate climbed a lot during the years when alcohol was prohibited, and then it dropped off after that. But that was all because of the organized crime that took root because of prohibition. So that, again, wasn't guns in and of itself. It was just the effects of the prohibition of alcohol. And that settled down. In the 1950s, for instance, we had relatively little in the way of gun control, both buying and carrying them. We had a homicide rate of 4 people per 100,000. Then in the 60s, we started to get on this gun control kick where we prohibited certain types of guns and the carrying of them was more. The homicide rate quickly spiked to 11 homicides per 100,000 and basically stayed there with a few little dips along the way until the carry laws started to become less restrictive around 1990 through a combination of legislation and court challenges. The rate dropped to about 4. Ever since, it's been about 4, and again, some dips and spikes. But all through those years, from the 60s through 1990, that rate about tripled and stayed up there with just a few dips once in a while through all those years. And now that you can carry through much of the U.S. much more easily, the rate has dropped a lot. I can't think of a starker example of the folly of gun control than that. if we were to loosen up the carry laws in the few big states where it's still restrictive, like Illinois and California, that rate would drop further yet. Chicago is a city where they need to allow honest citizens to carry guns. In fact, they're so fond of their social programs in Chicago. That needs to be a social program in Chicago, is to hand out the 45s and say a few hundred rounds of ammunition, and if you accept one of those, you need to carry it as the only stipulation. It's irresponsible that those people making those decisions in Chicago aren't allowing their own citizens to carry guns. It's much the same here in California. They turn all these criminals loose and they say, you can't carry guns. That is this state government not meeting its responsibilities to its own people, to the citizens here. The courts aren't meeting their responsibilities. The state government is not meeting their responsibilities to Californians. And if that gets bad enough, people eventually will get fed up. And I hope it doesn't go that way. I'd rather see this state government start to meet its responsibilities again. But there's a certain point where people will just say, you know what, we're not going to take any more. And that kind of stuff only happens when the government is not meeting its responsibilities. They are concentrating on everything under the sun in this state, except their actual responsibilities in state government. Dianne Feinstein is like that. She is someone that just really gets on my nerves because she is one of the most hypocritical people. When she was saying people shouldn't be able to carry guns, we have bodyguards protecting these people. And our tax dollars go to that, and they're always surrounded by security. And they tell us we can't even carry a handgun to protect ourselves from the criminals they turn loose. And that is not right. Dianne Feinstein had a concealed carry permit. She lives in San Francisco County. It is almost impossible for anyone to get a concealed carry permit in San Francisco County. The serfs, the peons, well, they can't get a concealed carry permit. Dianne Feinstein can. And she's one of the ones that's the biggest gun control advocates in our government. And she's the one saying, well, civilians shouldn't be able to own weapons of war. That's not what the Second Amendment means. Yes, actually, that is what the Second Amendment means. How soon people forget. When World War II ended, the Army was downsized because you don't need a big army when you aren't fighting a war. So they had all kinds of weapons of war left over, and they sold them to private people by the millions. And they are still in private hands today. They're semi-automatic rifles with high-capacity magazines that they sold to civilians all over the country. No one gave that a second thought then. 70 years later, all of a sudden, that's a big problem. That goes to show you how paranoid people have become about guns. And it is a paranoia, nothing more. There's nothing justified about this fear of guns. And I say that to my fellow Americans. I say that to people in the United Kingdom and Australia. There is no reason to be this paranoid about guns. The Second Amendment here in the USA, yes, it does protect weapons of war. There is no qualification in the Second Amendment that says the right to own certain types of guns shall not be infringed. It says the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. The right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And that means all arms. And even in the early days of our republic, there were people that, not only did they own muskets, but the wealthy merchants owned cannon. They outfitted their merchant ships with cannon to protect against pirates. So all of this red tape that makes it so difficult, even though it is legal, but it's just very difficult because of all the red tape to own things like grenade launchers or tanks or machine guns, artillery pieces. I mean, that people do own these things. Wealthy Americans still own artillery pieces and tanks and automatic weapons and anti-aircraft weapons. It's just very, very difficult because of all the red tape. And personally, I want to own a machine gun even if it was far easier. I personally don't see a need for it. But people should be able to, and that is part of freedom. I'm not even a person that's really passionate about guns. I am passionate about the Second Amendment. I've shot my friends' guns, the various types of guns they have. It wasn't until recently I actually owned one, but I've always been passionate about the Second Amendment. I think that's in part because it's not given the respect that other amendments do. We wouldn't, of all the Bill of Rights, you know, there's 10 amendments. 9 of them are treated very seriously, but the Second Amendment not so much, and that is wrong. And there's an inconsistency in that. Thank you if you've stuck with me this long. You know, this is something that, seeing that Brianne Worth's video and just the cluelessness of it all and the lack of facts. Logic has to be based on facts. If you're trying to build logical relationships and aren't starting with facts, your logic falls apart right away. I would just close by saying, don't trust anyone who says that you shouldn't own a gun. Because like I said, the vast majority of people, the farthest thing from their mind is harming anyone. They'll never do it. They're you know, you get these people like that guy that shot up the church in South Carolina and the Sandy Hook. And I understand that that's tragic, and we should do what it takes to stop those things where we can, but you know, those couple individuals, those few people, should not affect the rights of the tens of millions that would never do something like that. And that's what people like Brianne Worth miss.